The squirrel was magic!
Oops. Beware your human heart. This all kinds of technical difficulties tonight. This is Diabolical Index for July 16th, 2018, where the pages of the Uncanny reside. I'm Corey Dawson, as always. You might notice that I'm in a slightly different little corner of the nut house. They put together Corey's Corner down here for the Diabolical Index when I show up. And currently, I don't know if we're going out at all, are we?
Honestly, don't know.
Okay. So you may be...
Audio-wise you are, but video...
You may be seeing me, you may not be. So throw some comments as to whether or not you can see my beautiful, grizzled face. Let us know. But anyway, well, we kind of have some... let's see. We got some shares. Anything going on?
We're lagging. We're like super bad.
Okay. We're gonna go for the technical difficulties route on this thing. I don't know who, if anyone, is still out there, but
Just keep talking.
Basically, I wanted to put a shout out there, and I'll repeat it if we have to reestablish contact once again. But it is important for you to go to podcastawards.com and make sure that you recognize Pointless Discussions. They are involved in the Podcast Awards for 2018. Make sure that you vote for them. It's a very simple process. You go on there and give them a little bit of information, I think email address, things like that, so you can get an account with the Podcast Awards. And once you have, make sure you go to the People's Choice Awards and the comedy heading, and definitely vote for Pointless Discussions. Their infamous reign of terror and comedy needs to be recognized at these awards. Paul and Mark tirelessly ignore their mental illnesses in order to bring you some great comedy, as well as some great improv, as evidenced by Planet H for months and months. I don't know how many months they've been doing it for, but I've been part of it myself, and it's been a ton of fun. So make sure you go to podcastawards.com, set it up, go to Pointless Discussions on the comedy and People's Choice Awards, and make sure that you throw some votes out there for them and give them some love. Definitely have some births to talk about this week. We don't have any pictures yet, I don't think, but there are some very important authors that need to be recognized. And one I'm going to mention, I honestly don't know as much as I should about the author, but that doesn't change the fact that he's a legend in his field. So I was mentioning him first, since we don't have any. I wasn't going to bring up a picture of him because I haven't read his work, but I am aware of his work. I'm aware of the critical accolades and just the sheer readership of Cormac McCarthy. Was born in July. The author of Blood Meridian, and I think All the Pretty Horses, as well as the more famous ones. I kind of wanted to mention them last because there are films involved with them, but No Country for Old Men and The Road. Cormac McCarthy, as far as I know. Like I said, I have a limited knowledge of his work, but he's holding up the whole finger. I don't know if you can hear me or see me.
Alright,
Continue. Okay. But I believe that there's a kind of like a modern Western sensibility to his work. Um, Gritty, but not overplayed. Kind of there are noir aspects sometimes with kind of like the crime stories, but they always have a Western lilt to them in one way or another. Even The Road, um, there's a definite drifter in the Western lands quality to it. So Cormac McCarthy, like I said, I don't know much about his. I know about his work. I just haven't read any of his work, so I can't talk from experience. But I don't know many people who don't enjoy his work who have read him. So there you go. Cormac McCarthy, born in July. Um, Definitely someone I am familiar with, though. I'm familiar with the next two names I'm going to mention in many, many ways. Many, many ways. Many different media. Uh, Definitely the first one I'm going to mention is Dr. Gonzo himself. Hunter S. Thompson was born in July. The absolutely world-renowned Gonzo journalist from the 60s, 70s, into the 80s, the Reagan years, after his bouts with his nemesis Richard Nixon. He put out some of the most scathing, biting, mind-blowing journalism that had ever come to pass. His books of articles, as far as I know, I think that he rarely did full-on books without having it being kind of like broken up into articles for Blast and Rolling Stone and Playboy, things like that. But everyone, I mean, anyone who watches the podcast has to be familiar with Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, at least the journey of Raoul Duke and his lawyer to the fabulous I think it was the Sands Hotel. I can't remember what the name of the hotel was, but they went for this motorcycle race, and it ended up being like one of the most trippy, far out adventures in journalism. And I mean, how much was fiction? I mean, it was basically all a tall tale when you came down to it, laced with drugs and violence and craziness in every direction. He wrote one of the foremost authoritative books on the Hells Angels for a little while, and in fact, I think that he came under fire from the Hells Angels themselves. They, I think they kind of purported that he had blown some things out of proportion and made some things up. And I mean, when it comes down to it, I mean, it's Gonzo journalism. Chances are the truth was in the right places, and anything that was embellished upon, it probably couldn't have gotten any more far out than that to begin with. So, born this month, July, Dr. Gonzo, Hunter S. Thompson. Definitely check out his work. It still rings true today. There's nothing that he talks about in his work that doesn't apply, especially now. It's probably a good thing that he hasn't been around for the things that have been going on lately. He could probably write sheafs of articles about the state of the world at the moment. It's in such upheaval. But there you go, Hunter S. Thompson, born in July. The last one I'm going to mention is a personal favorite of mine from a long way back, who it's one of those authors where you're not exactly sure which came first, the chicken or the egg, when it comes to experiencing his work. Because a friend of mine who actually was my first entry on the podcast, Nate Southard, the writer of Porcelain and others. I'm about 95% sure that I didn't know about Robert R. McCammon before Nate turned me on to him. I think, if I remember correctly, I think we were in home ec class, and he passed me Stinger, one of McCammon's works, where the cover shows kind of like this cracked, arid desert with this lizard-looking humanoid hand with these gigantic, glistening claws coming out of the dirt, the dust and sand. It was totally breathtaking. And after that, I ended up reading The Wolf's Hour, which is about it's a book that I'm flabbergasted that they haven't made into a movie yet. It's perfect movie material. And as it goes along, I mean, you can kind of see that it kind of knows that there's an epic scale due to the fact that it's basically about a Russian agent during World War II, working for the Americans, and he's a werewolf. So you have a werewolf behind enemy lines during Nazi Germany, World War II. It's totally fantastic. It has things that at the time not many werewolf horror books, films for that matter. It went a lot of places that they didn't go. Nowadays, with the rise and kind of plateau and certain fall of supernatural romance, it's no big deal to think about the romantic aspects of a werewolf towards a human or otherwise. And Wolf's Hour, I think, did it with a lot of class and grace and thoroughness, definitely. But to mention that and not mention others, I mean, A Boy's Life, Gone South, Mystery Walk, Usher's Passing. It's a truly great stack of work, and I think that for a little while, I think that there were a lot of people who thought that Robert R. McCammon was gonna not necessarily surpass King, but kind of fall in lines with the King, Coons, Straub, kind of like the Line, that type of thing. In fact, a lot of the kind of like the mid-range work of his during the 80s and early 90s, even the font they used was kind of akin to the Straub, not necessarily Coons, but Straub and King's work. So I think they always thought of him as kind of like a close cousin. But in my opinion, he never fell victim to kind of like the trappings of notoriety and that whole kind of like Mark Twain, like the Mark Twain of horror of Stephen King, like when, it just becomes synonymous, and it never really happened for him, and hopefully that's kind of kept him as a black sheep and a dark horse in the running. So definitely check out Robert McCammon. I mentioned him before. I did Gone South on the podcast, so definitely check it out. So yeah, there you go. Born in July, Robert R. McCammon, Hunter S. Thompson, and Cormac McCarthy. Those are the three births in July. I didn't have any deaths really to speak of this week. So
we have dropped over 1,000. We've been over it almost the entire time. The audio seems like it sounds fine, but just to be safe, you want to record this and put it up after.
Okay.
Does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds fine. So there you go. The first book I wanted to talk about tonight was it's kind of illustriously named.
Is that fine?
That's fine.
All right. Well, I'm gonna do it now, so
okay.
You can tell them what's going on.
Okay. Does that disrupt something?
Yeah, everything.
Okay.
Do you want to keep going, or did you? I'm sorry.
So am I gonna start over?
No, I mean we can, yeah. But the audio seems like it's fine, but if you look at it.
Let's just go ahead.
Just go ahead and stop it.
No, let's just go ahead with it. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. This is kind of a mystery date. If it doesn't work out, hopefully I can make it up to you later. But anyway, the Panopticon by Jenni Fagan, which is it's really interesting that her last name is Fagan due to the importance of that name to the Charles Dickens work when it comes to wayward children. And the protagonist of the Panopticon is definitely a wayward child. Her name is Anais Hendricks. She's a Scottish 15-year-old who has basically kicked and screamed and clawed her way through life and in and out of many institutions during all of her years, especially the ones trying to find out where she comes from. And it starts to become a story of histories and monsters as family and family of monsters. Because the only family that she knows is the one with the institution, and the titular Panopticon. And the Panopticon, like I said, it's an illustrious title that doesn't really. It's kind of a shame because the cover kind of is set up and it shows bars and color, and it's a very interesting cover, a very interesting title. Basically, the Panopticon was thought up by Jeremy Bentham in the history of penology and of prisons, and basically the idea of the Panopticon, which apparently was never built, but is, I would like to say it's a focal point of the story, but the focal point is Anais herself. But a Panopticon is a C-shaped group of cells, a bank of cells, and in the center of that C is a cylindrical tower in which guards would watch the entire prison. So it's like omniscient. You can't move around without being seen. And of course, this was before the time of constant surveillance that we're in now. So you could say that the Panopticon is alive and well and all around us as we speak, especially with this camera right here. But in her case, it kind of serves as a little bit of an exciting balm of the story that never really gets picked up, which doesn't necessarily dunk the story or anything like that, but it is kind of a shame that it wasn't explained more at length. It's mostly brought up as kind of like a seed of paranoia in her mind, because there are these two-way windows down this center spire of the care center for wayward. Not remembered by her, she ended up putting a policewoman into a coma named Dawn, and it keeps coming up during her interrogation sessions in the offices. But just like always, for this character anyway, she was on too many drugs to even remember her own name. So, I mean, does that smack of innocence? Does it smack of guilt? Who's to say? But in her travels, I think it was something like 51 incarcerations of one way or another, one of which being at an asylum that she remembers kind of like with this nightmarish quality, with gargoyles and this kind of like chattering, creeping monk that may have known her ex-prostitute mother. So she goes on this stream of consciousness explanation of being born in the back of a convenience store and being born on a soft pillow and maybe in the midst of animals and all these things, as if she has to create her own history as she goes along, because she says that that notoriety is currency within themselves. To enter, all of the inmates see the new fish, the brand new incoming traffic that will either be crushed underfoot or made to serve or might lead in her case and in others. But in this case, it's not your basic prison story paradigm, because it ends up being more of a story of searching for family and finding it in a place that connects to you, but only in the worst ways. And also another question of the Panopticon is, at what point does nostalgia and does being soft on the program make you wonder whether or not the author, apparently the author herself, Jenni Fagan, came from a care center herself. So there's definitely a lot of experience and history that has gone into the writing of this. And but at the same time, I mean, the Panopticon, it was built in this story, and it was known throughout history by different philosophers as kind of like the crushing weight of bureaucracy and total surveillance in every way. But in this, it's kind of a dark tower that has no meaning, because they're only locked up at night. They're allowed to to roam about freely, and they, the inmates and the guards and the leaders kind of say that they have a holistic approach. So basically, the Panopticon is a misleading title, and it's kind of a thread that's left dangling, really. And I guess the only thing that's really watching her is herself and the others that she finds herself engaged with. I don't know if it's Isla, is an anorexic, HIV positive mother who has a partner that wants to get married and get them out of there. And there's a kid who was involved in like bestiality and liked to beat up old people, and there are all these characters that you shouldn't feel for, but in a lot of ways, you meet some of them through the eyes of this, repeat offender, and there's a wistfulness against her better judgment, especially when she talks tough. Like they say that she has the heart of a shark, but at the same time, she won't allow animals or old people. She doesn't like bullies. Which makes sense since she's been lorded over by an authoritarian hand for a long time. But that hand doesn't. It's not made of steel in this story, and it's kind of a shame that it comes off in some of the ways that it does, because you don't want to wish ill on anyone, especially a young person in this situation. But the story kind of falls soft in a lot of ways. It seems like a lot of bluster, which doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that horrible things don't occur all over the world to all races of children and sexes, races, genders, and all those things. But at the same time, there's this hint of paranoia that is just like the most basic hint you can possibly think of, and it just doesn't come to fruition. So it ends up being a good character story and a sympathetic story of this girl's plight and her establishment of a new family behind the scenes and within the walls of the Panopticon. So it's a good story. It's a heart. I'm not gonna say it's heartwarming, but it's definitely recognizable to anyone who's gone through any sort of hardship and come out the other side as a caring person and feeling person, even though you might be rough around the edges and that sort of thing. I hear some rumblings out there.
Well, don't mind me.
My God.
I'm just getting some junk and stuff.
Ernie's here for some junk and stuff.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of junk and stuff down in this nut house.
I think there's some unused beers out there if you want some.
Oh, I love unused beer.
Oh, and also if you want to go rooting for the trash for that damned beef fried rice I attempted to eat earlier, I was eating my guts out like some kind of alien embryo. You can have that too.
That sounds delicious.
Make sure you eat with your hands. All right.
I'm out of here. Bye, guys.
All right, see you, Ernie. Be careful out there, man. I can hear his hips grinding as he moves up the steps. So, junk and stuff. It's always good to have a guest star. And, I guess I made good. Last week I said that it would be these two books and maybe more. That's about as more as you can possibly get. He's more everything. He's more of a man than any one of us. So, anyway, there you go. Basically, I'm not going to say it was a disappointing book. It basically, I guess it kind of, in some ways, I wanted to mention at the top, and I forgot due to all the technical jazz that was going on.
We're good now.
But a lot of my friends have kind of been after my ass because I haven't seen or experienced a lot of different kind of popular things that have come out lately that they thought that I would be all over. And one of them is Stranger Things. I just watched up to the 5th. Yeah, Andrew's looking at me with this incredulous look on his face. Yeah. So, like I say to them, it's not as if I didn't want to watch it. I wanted to watch it. But, Netflix was out of reach, and I didn't want to pick around. I wanted to have it all. So, we were at Target the other day, and I found the the VHS edition of the Blu-rays of Stranger Things, so we tried them on for size, and just like I knew that I would, I totally fell in love with it. But that's not what I'm trying to talk about. What I'm trying to talk about is A Quiet Place. I also watched that a couple nights ago, which I narrowly missed. There was a double feature at the Dollar Saver Cinema with Hereditary and A Quiet Place, but I missed it just by a hair's breadth. I would have loved to have watched those two back to back. But basically, with A Quiet Place, just as it is with this, in this case, they kind of build up the kind of on the front end. They make you think that there's going to be this dark authoritarian bent to the story, and the only authoritarian bent there is that it exists, is that it's there. It doesn't actually impinge on her in any other way than just kind of keeping her contained, and she just like struggles and fights back against it. Although it's one of those things where if we always respect the ones who go against the grain of society, but when the only Jennifer, check it out. I have no doubt that you would love it. What were you asking me?
What book is this?
This book is a Panopticon by Jennifer Fagan. So
Put it back up. I put it down because I thought you were done talking about it. I'm sorry.
basically, but what I'm trying to say with A Quiet Place, not necessarily versus Panopticon, is that in A Quiet Place, when you see the previews and the trailers, you think this is going to be the scariest movie ever because of the lack of sound. Everything is going to be so silent that any sound at all is going to reverberate and just scare the living shit out of you. But what I found with that movie, there were definitely scary parts. There were a lot of really intense feelings of dread, and because early on you learn that you can't really expect everything to turn out all right. But in this case, what I found out with A Quiet Place, and it serves to its credit, is that it ends up being a story about family so deeply that the horror that happens is almost secondary to the relationships between the members of the family. So in this case, it's kind of the same, because it ends up being Anais's story, and it's the story of her lost family and found family, and the exploration of just rebellion in every form, and that it doesn't necessarily have to exclude any sort of caring or humanity behind it. And also, the cool part about it is that it operates from this kind of like Irvine Welsh Train Spotting. Train Spotting was a book as well, and sometimes it can get really, really tough to read because the Scottish accent is done phonetically through the writing. So, huh?
I said, oh, jeez.
Yeah. So, but
I love the movie.
if you try to read it out loud, if you can try to read it out loud as if if you've seen the film, if you try to read it like that, you can make a good go of it. But this isn't quite as hardcore when it comes to that. It still has little touches here and there, and I think it worked out well. But there you go, Panopticon by Jenni Fagan. I would say if you want a study of a young girl's plight, something of her own making, rebellion of her own making, but at the same time kind of searching for the framework of her life and finding it within this omniscient prison of a care center, then it's a good read. It's a good read regardless. She's probably one of the most plucky heroines that's ever existed, but kind of in my mind, there weren't a whole lot of things that she had done in her later life that couldn't be attributed to her own drives, wants, and outbursts and lashing. So there you go. It's pretty well balanced. But I was a little bit disappointed that Panopticon didn't turn out to be this looming dark presence as much as I would have hoped. So there you go. However, the next book is called The Devil's Alphabet by Daryl Gregory. And it's funny about this book. Once I had realized I go through the library and I try to find books that have some kind of relation to each other. In this case, it was, a family of monsters versus monsters as family. So it's like, when you have a family and it turns out that, they engage in bestiality, or they murder or rape or anything like that you could find behind the walls of the Panopticon, versus family becoming monsters. So in this case, Devil's Alphabet refers to the letters in the genetic code, because the protagonist, Pax, which is short for Paxton, and Pax also means peace, so that's interesting. But he ends up going back to his hometown, which he left behind, to way behind. I believe it was 15 years before the beginning of the book. And it just so happened to coincide with what they call the change. Now, I'm going to have to look at my notes for this because I can't remember what the name of the disease is called. But basically, when Pax left his hometown, which Switch Creek is the name of the town, and it's totally, especially myself, I can totally relate to it in every single way. Because I'm from a small town, and I moved away and came back to a small town, and it's totally relatable, absolutely recognizable in this story. But I guess that Devil's Alphabet is his debut novel, and it was funny as I was going along, because I had noticed when I found out the author's name that I had accidentally bought a few of his later books, because I ended up being really interested in the subject matter. And so when I found this, and then I kind of related to Panopticon, and I found out it was his first book, I was more than interested, especially when I found out what the subject matter was. Basically, a retrovirus moves through this small town, and only through this town. It's not, I'm not going to say how it comes about. There are theories that are never concluded. One of the good things about this book is it leaves a lot of questions that can only be answered by your own decisions, your own opinions on what's happening, because Pax in and of himself is kind of he's kind of the best kind of unreliable narrator, because everything is coming from kind of like the lens of his experience, and the lens of his drive to leave his hometown, and then his dread at coming back after the change. Now, the name of the retrovirus is the transcription divergence syndrome, and basically, it's non-communicable. It only happens to this one town, and it's the best kind. I hesitate to call it magical reality, because there's nothing magical about it. But it's such a fantastically visual idea what happens, and I'm stalling because it's such a great thing in this story. Because when it begins, you're just thinking about the dread and the apprehension of going to see a bunch of people from your past, much like a reunion that you haven't seen in years. You've changed since then. They probably changed. They remember you as who you were, and vice versa with them. And you both end up being wrong, and sometimes in the most awkward ways. But in this case, the change happened before he left. And the transcription, I forgot what it was called, transcription divergence syndrome. His friend, he had a group of friends growing up, Jolynn and Deke. And as he's driving home, he notices a vehicle on the side of the road, and this giant, like 11-foot tall, hulking, hunchbacked, elongated gray figure standing next to it, rummaging around in the engine to see if they can't get it fixed. This is what's known as an Argo. And an Argo is one of the denizens of Switch Creek who is affected by TDS in one direction. And they become these gray, kind of slightly horse-faced versions of themselves after the virus has run its course in their body. And apparently, one of the traits of the Argo is that they're incredibly helpful. So not only is he trying to speed away from this hulking creature that he hasn't seen for 15 years, he thinks to himself about how helpful they become. The Argos are naturally benign, gentle giants who are incredibly helpful. So he's afraid he's going to get roped into being helped, which sometimes can be one of the worst punishments imaginable. Hell's paved with good intentions and all of that sort of thing. So it really sounds absurd coming out of my mouth talking about the Argos, because that's only one. There are four types of people that are left behind in Switch Creek once Pax has left town, and now he returns because Jo Lynn has committed suicide unexpectedly. And she was a beta, what they call a beta, which is kind of like this crimson-skinned, seal-like mutation of the human body. Okay, Jennifer's talking about wild cards. I wish I could talk more about wild cards. It's one of those things that I was really interested in pursuing when I was much, much younger, and I just didn't have a chance to get into it. There was I'm not exactly sure what the reason behind the changes that happened to humanity during wild cards, but they were kind of like beautiful monsters and superheroes that could do things that no one else could do, and villains who were misshapen in one way or another, but then glamorous in others and things like that. But yeah, she mentions Wild Cards by George R.R. Martin way before his Game of Thrones fame. And one of these days I would like to find, if I could, kind of like a collected Wild Cards, if I could, because I was always interested. But yeah, this is sort of like that, except maybe not quite as grandiose. But the betas end up becoming, it's one of those things where the betas are strictly female, and Jo Lynn, the suicide and an old friend of Pax's, ends up being one of the first to not try to take a husband, and she ends up reproducing parthenogenically. So there becomes no need for a male entrance into their life. So they end up taking husbands as kind of more like a statement of tradition more than anything else. But they all end up with these head sashes, and pregnancy becomes sort of an honor, like a badge of accomplishment in their what they call a clade. The Argos, I'm really glad they didn't call them alphas. I think that was what he was kind of going away from, because the Argos are definitely they're not in what you would normally refer to as an alpha. They're the gentle giants. But so basically the center of the story is that he comes home for the funeral of his friend, and he ends up meeting old friends and faces in the crowd from the town that he had known before he left. And so he'll see an old bully that had beaten him up over touching their car or something like that when they were in high school. But then when the guy sees him at the funeral, he acts as if he doesn't even recognize him. And it's possible he doesn't recognize him because the story is about the acknowledgement of humanity, and in some cases kind of like the difficulty with dealing with difference and that type of underlying thread. But in this case, the way Gregory handles it is a really super soft touch. So it doesn't beat you over the head with these things, and you end up kind of like, almost accidentally thinking of the themes of the story, because the the family, like dealing with family and friends the way that he's forced to do when he comes back home, is completely relatable to everything. So when you start hearing about these creatures that used to be men and women, it becomes so commonplace to you that it fades to almost complete obscurity in the story, because the characters are so well brought out and so recognizable and true that you forget. Especially when he meets kind of like the matriarch of the town. I think her name's Aunt Rhonda. Can't remember now. Something like that. But she's everyone's aunt, basically. And she's the third type of changed person in town. She's what they call a Charlie. And Charlies are just incredibly bloated versions of humanity. They end up becoming these blob creatures that skitter around on human feet, and you can barely make out the features of their face because it's so swollen with protuberance. So when you see, you can it's so visual. It's so visual, but not overly so. It's totally the whole thing is totally quotable when it comes to re-meeting these people that were in his life and then went through the change, and he didn't. He's known as a skip, which was the very few that remained once the retrovirus had run its course. There were the Argos, the Betas, and the Charlies left over, and then most of the people who weren't affected died, and then there was a contingent of non-changed people that survived, and they were called the skips. So once everything, the most smoke had cleared, and Pax had found his calling, he ended up leaving Switch Creek. And after he did, there were things that happened without the entrance of some sort of changed, mutated human form. There are riots, and there are murders against type and class, like, happen throughout human history without the entrance of this retrovirus. So there are things throughout the story that totally ring true. They're totally it's just wonderful. The writing is completely wonderful. You forget, it seems totally commonplace to you just after a few pages of dealing with these characters, because they're complete people. They're not some sort of strange entity. They're not an alien force. They're normal people who have been changed physically, and in some cases there are other attributes, like the betas produce something called vintage, which is, I'm not going to say too much about, but it's fantastic. It's got everything that you'd find, everything you could relate to if you've ever, you can't go home again. He said, or not he said, but another author said that I won't mention. But it's one of those things where everyone experiences that when you've been away for a while, when people that you wouldn't recognize from Adam, and then they come up to you. In my case, sometimes I'll be out somewhere and someone will use both my names, Corey Dawson, and then I'll turn around and I know for a fact that if someone's using both of my names, that I'm not going to recognize them, because it's been so long that they have to show me in some kind of way that they totally know who I am. And there's that terror, because you don't know how far back in your past this person has been. And in this case, he ends up seeing one of his good friends in that group again, Deke, who has become an Argo, and his wife, who the female Argos are even larger than the males are. So when he sits on the ground next to Joe Lynn's grave, his knees, just as if you're like sitting there with your knees up, they go above his head. So Pax is sitting there talking to this monstrosity that used to be his friend, but nothing's changed. It's exactly the same feeling as, they remember, they have this mutual remembrance of laying on the floor with Joe Lynn, just hanging out. when they were still human. So it's a question of humanity. It's a question of what changes, when we change for whatever reason. Is it a detriment? Is it a benefit? Have we gained a new facet of humanity? Have we become subhuman? It's a fantastic story, and it really makes me excited to read the other books that I've picked up from Daryl Gregory, because if this is a debut, it's so rich with heart, but not sappy, and it definitely makes statements, but they're muted. It doesn't have to hit you over the head with all these moral certainties about everything. It totally lets you run with your own pronouncements and with your own determinations about what makes someone human, what makes them subhuman, what changes people, what stays the same. So I can't recommend it more highly. And it turns out that there are other mysteries in town, because especially since he knew Jolene. It wasn't a case of someone that he barely met. It was someone that he had known all of his life. So to him, the fact that she took her own life, especially when she had 2 daughters of her own, after the change, I believe, if I remember correctly. So there were betas as well. And, there's a question of whether or not the parthenogenic offspring are actually just copies. But that makes no difference to him. He knows that she wouldn't leave them alone. So there's a definite question about what truly happened in Switch Creek that night that Jolene died. And it's fantastic. It's fantastic. And, I'm sure there was some that would say, it would have been just as powerful a story if the more the stranger elements were left out. And I totally disagree. Mostly, especially with one of my, I always thought to myself, if I ever became a teacher, and I wanted to maybe show the kids something about differences in people and how they were worked out with heart and with determination and wherewithal to make sure that that 2 people can come together as humans no matter what the differences are, race, color, or creed. I wouldn't go for the obvious ones. I would honestly go for the Wolfgang, it's probably Wolfgang Peterson film, Enemy Mine, with Dennis Quaid and, oh my God, I'm gonna forget that guy's name, Louis Gossett Jr. If you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor and just buy it. It's fantastic. It's one of the best representations of difference and the hardships of war and trying to come to terms with 2 people as beings, not necessarily human, in the face of war and revenge and spite and class system and racism, total racism, over galaxies, over the length and breadth of galaxies, for the stupidest things. In fact, I think that the main thrust of that movie is mining. So, I mean, there's nothing in that movie that doesn't ring true now. And you're talking about a human being and a lizard creature. So I think that in that case, exactly the same thing happens as in the Devil's Alphabet. Personally, I think the Devil's Alphabet is kind of like the opposite of the Panopticon. I think that Jenni Fagan should have run a little bit more with the kind of like the mystery of the name, the Panopticon, and its history with Jeremy Bentham, and how it was kind of like this cold, dark history of penology. Whereas with this, I think the Devil's Alphabet is kind of a, I don't know. I think that the name says a lot, and might mislead you. And in this case, I mean, misleading isn't necessarily bad because then you're kind of surprised and you make your own determinations and stuff. But in this case, I think that another name that was maybe a little bit more subdued would have helped. But then again, it was his first work, and it is kind of a clever way to talk about the genetic code. So I guess it makes sense. I think that it would have gone. I think that the name is slightly too active, maybe a little bit like horrific sounding, or maybe even diabolical. One of those things. Not that I normally really complain about that, but in this case, I think it might give someone the wrong idea. But I thought I had another one for the enemy mine. Oh, District 9. District 9. Neil Blomkamp? Neil Blomkamp? District 9 is a fantastic version of that too. And in that case, it's a little bit more, there's more of a statement there. There's kind of a moral thing, because someone human actually starts to become the thing that he felt animosity towards, just for being who they were and being stuck on this planet. I totally recommend District 9, because you could plug any disenfranchised peoples on the Earth into the place of the prawns, what they call the prawns. These alien slaves that are left behind on Earth, half dead. But you could totally do the same thing with that. But there's a little bit more. It's leading you in a direction, a little bit. I mean, definitely, Enemy Mine definitely tugs at your heartstrings and stuff too. But in District 9, there's a definite statement as to what's going on. Not that it's a bad one. In my opinion, the special effects that brings the prawns to life, and for really kind of like the arms race that happens in South Africa due to it, and the slums there, I think that it all really comes together nicely.
They're supposed to make a sequel soon, I think.
They've been talking about District 10. Andrew's talking about a sequel. They've been talking about District 10 for a while now. I'm not sure if Neil Blomkamp's going to do it, but I totally recommend checking out his Oats stuff. Zygote. Good God. Neil Blomkamp. Zygote. That is crazy stuff. Have you seen that, Andrew?
What is it?
Zygote is part of the Oats series. From, I think it came straight on YouTube, if I remember correctly. And I think that was some sort of statement of against big production companies. So they just put that stuff out on their own, and there's this part in Zygote where I don't even know what's happening, but it's this gigantic ball of limbs like moving down this hallway. It is freaky. But I digress. Somehow I always end up talking about movies. But hey, if TJ, I know I saw you on there before. I just got another copy of The Ruins, and I found my copy of the book. So I'm going to start getting ready for that. Everybody keep your eyes peeled for that. Because TJ and I might just be working on something together. So, anyway, Devil's Alphabet. Totally recommended, and not for the reasons you might think. So, definitely check it out. Daryl Gregory. He also wrote Pandemonium, and I think one's called Spoonbenders. It's about a family of magicians, and it's one of those things where after reading this, and after accidentally finding out about him and being interested in those other things, I know for a fact that I'm probably gonna be looking around for everything he does. So, not that Panopticon was a disappointment. It was just that I think that there were things that were left on the table with that book. Definitely, it totally encompassed the story of a young girl in the throes of this system, which is basically it's destroying young lives. But is there a better system? Not yet. Probably not. So there's a futility there that definitely comes through. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the thing that's watching them and watching us all. It's like this utter futility of this complete awareness, or not necessarily awareness, but watchfulness with no awareness of what is actually going on. And I don't know where it came from, but I knew it was one of those ancient places where they said, only believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. So in that case, anyone who's watching is never going to get the whole story. But then there again, okay. The Panopticon by Jenni Faber, or I keep saying Faber, Fagan. Jenni Fagan, the Panopticon by Jenni Fagan. Check that out. And definitely The Devil's Alphabet by Daryl Gregory and everything else he writes. Definitely check out Robert R. McCammon's work from beginning to end. There's nothing that I would leave out of his work. And he has some relatively new stuff called Speaks the Nightbird. It's a two-volume book. And also definitely read Hunter Thompson. There are things that are coming back around again. There's no doubt about it, because it was always truthful, except when it was slightly embellished due to the use of drugs. But that doesn't necessarily, the lack of inhibitions doesn't necessarily a liar make. So check that out definitely as well. And definitely check out Cormac McCarthy. I need to take my own advice. The fact that I haven't read The Road or No Country for Old Men at least is just a black mark on my record. And I've also heard that Blood Meridian is like one of the greatest books of all time. So I definitely need to be checking those out myself. And also make sure you check out podcastawards.com. What do you think of that segue? Yeah. Make sure you check out podcastawards.com. Look around for pointless discussions. I'm sure they stick out like a sore thumb. Make sure you vote for them for Comedy Podcast Awards and the People's Choice, because it is your choice, people. And thanks to you for choosing Magic Scroll Network, even though we were at the mercy of some technological bullshit earlier. But as always, Andrew has pulled through in a clinch. Couldn't do it without him. There's no better guy to have at your side laughing at your frustration and pain. Because totally unflappable. If I have any say in what's going on this guy's headstone, it's going to say, the unflappable Andrew Moore, because he just cannot be flapped. That's a challenge, actually. Anyone who wants to take up that challenge and try to flap, I would love to see someone actually make Andrew pissed off. That would be really, really interesting. And I see him get a little bit hot under the collar when the tech doesn't work, but that's only because he loves some perfection, but he doesn't get bent out of shape about it. He tries his best, and if it doesn't work, he just laughs and goes for the first not skunked Rheingeist he can find. I have no idea where my tea is. In fact, I think on this table, my nice little desk here, it's totally weathered by time and age and all these like spots and everything. I love it. I probably need to get a hot plate and like a tea cozy right here, so there can always be tea at the ready. And that would be awesome. And I wish I smoked a pipe at moments like this. I think that would really go a long way, but not as of yet. Maybe when I'm older, who knows? I'm still looking for those glasses to kind of like balance out this gigantic head and these furry eyebrows. I digress. And the beef fried rice didn't kill me, so that's always good. For a while there, I wasn't quite sure I wasn't going to need a bucket. But there's life for you. Anyway, go to podcastawards.com, vote for Pointless Discussions in the Comedy and People's Choice. Definitely read Cormac McCarthy, Hunter S. Thompson, and Robert R. McCammon. Read The Panopticon by Jenni Fagan, and The Devil's Alphabet by Daryl Gregory. And definitely check out next Monday. I will not be slacking again with any luck. No, I won't be slacking next weekend. I don't think so. On Monday.
Sick again, right?
Huh?
Unless you get sick again with all this bad Chinese food.
No. It's just burn the candle at both ends and spinning plates while you're at it. I mean, there's just so much stuff. But I'm currently looking for the perfect choose your own adventure. I went to a local store of some renown to try to find some choose your own adventures, and the ones they had were horrible. They were just horrible. They were like some sort of not reprints, but kind of like fake half-ass versions that they started doing in the late 90s or something. They were horrible. The illustrations were pitiful, and the stories were crap. So, but I already have one on deck. I actually have a few on deck, but there's one that I haven't shown before that has to do with Stonehenge. So I was thinking about, it looked pretty cool. I think it had like a druid guy on there. So if it's not too hot, I got a cloak just waiting for something like that.
Frankenstory thing's pretty cool.
Well, I wanted to do the Frankenstory thing. Okay, here's the deal. I'll take this opportunity, since Andrew brought it up, to explain the Frankenstory idea. Basically, oops, I think I just knocked that camera out of whack.
That's fine. You're on this one.
But Frankenstory was based on an idea that I had where, since we have this live medium, that a story would be written from the fragments that you guys would give me. So it would kind of be like a Mad Lib type of thing, except I would just kind of write parts as we went along, and then I would try to fit in the parts that you would write in your live stream to fit it and make some sort of sense as we went along. So, especially with the delay, it could be kind of interesting, because since it's not in real time, wouldn't be like falling all over ourselves. There'd be a few seconds here and there to kind of plug things in. So, Frankenstory, just an idea I had for piecing things together to make some kind of monstrosity, and that's basically all it was. No one paid attention, but that doesn't mean that it's dead. It's waiting to come to life. So, let me know. Message Magna Scroll Network in one way or another. Paradox City Books and Games, if you'd like, or my personal thing, or Andrew Moore, anybody, or Magic Scroll Network thing, let me know. But let me know if you'd like to do Frankenstory or anything. I've had Jennifer had expressed some desire to do a group write. So, in the Frankenstory, that's kind of more of a comedic thing to try to make a story out of a bunch of stuff that doesn't belong. But I think that she was talking more about it like a group write, where we were actually trying to do a volley, where I write something and then someone else writes something that makes sense. I don't know how possible it is with the delay and things. It's hard to say. So planning for it to be weird is probably the best defense. Jennifer says she's paying attention. I know she is. I know you are. She said she's paying attention to the Frankenstory. Well, there you go. I have some staunch supporters. So let me know if you'd like to do the Frankenstory or the Stonehenge Choose Your Own Adventure next week. Just in light of having to plan for Frankenstory, it might end up being the Stonehenge, and then we'll plan that for a couple weeks after that. But it just depends on the drive to do it. Let me know. I might end up putting a poll up about it to see what you think again. Because I made that snazzy ass logo for Frankenstory, so I might just plug that in there again. But anyway, this has been the Diabolical Index for July 16th, 2008. Beware your human heart. This right here, the new desk in Corey's Corner, is where the pages of the uncanny reside. Make sure Andrew's laughing at my segues. That's all right. That's just fine. That's what I get. I spend a little time on radio. You know that?
Yeah, you told me. Yeah.
Heck yeah. So
that's how you got this gig.
He's saying that's how I got this gig. I thought it had to do with their absolute lack of literary content, but
yeah, it is.
You never know. Who knows? Anyhow, it's been great being with you. Hopefully, it wasn't too much of a shambles earlier with the technical difficulties, but I will see you next Monday. As always, keep it squirrely.
The squirrel was magic.
I need to have